Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we will finally be doing another real-time portrait sketch, and it's been such a long time since my last one, so I'm really excited to do this one with you guys. By the way, if you guys enjoyed the sketch, I turned it into a watercolor painting and I just uploaded the full real-time tutorial up on my Patreon, so if you guys think that's interesting, I also have the link to that in the description. I wanted to do a more of a stylized portrait, so while we will have our reference photo in the screen, we will try not to be too strict about following it completely. We're just gonna let our sketch be as natural as it's gonna go. For this video, I am using two pencils and it will be my two favorite pencils. The first one is my Black Wing Matte. This is just going to be for our initial sketch. This isn't as dark as the other one, so it's great for the initial outline. The next one is super dark. It's our Lumograph Black, and it's not just dark, it's very matte, so gonna be great for getting those very dark shadows and very dark values for the shading in our sketch too. So since we are following the Lumis method, we are of course going to start with our initial sphere, or just this circle for the very top of the head. Since it's been so long since the last time I did this, kind of hard for me to draw this one circle. I find it easier to draw in these boxy lines. So imagine a square first before I can even draw a circle now. But yeah, however way you can draw a circle, just try to get to it. It's also doesn't have to be perfect. It does have to be as spherical as we can get it. This is just the very top of the skull, so you want to imagine the rest of the face is going to be a lot longer than this, so do save in some space in your paper for the rest of the portrait too. I then want to cut out the side of the sphere so that it's more flat, just how the side of the head is going to be. And then I'm just doing this cross right at the very center of that flat surface on the side, and then we're going to use that to basically draw in the outlines for our face. So the top of that cross we're just going to put in as a line, and that would be the hairline. The center line is going to be following the brow bone, and then the bottom is just going to be where the nose ends. And then we're going to draw an extra line which is about the same height as those other three, and that is going to be the height of her face. So we're going to use that to mark out where we want the jaw to end. So once we have that, we're just going to follow where the center line of her face is going to be. For her, she's slightly facing the left side, so we're going to have that very center line off to the side too. You want to imagine this is where her features are gonna face. So just try to imagine the same line going across our reference photo. And then I'm just gonna roughly connect the lines. Very quickly just draw in the jaw and the chin right now. Doesn't have to be accurate for now, just need a placeholder for those areas until we can get to drawing in the rest of her. So it doesn't have to be perfect. We just need it to be about the same size where we marked out that last line. And then from the center of that cross beside her head, I am gonna draw her ear. This is gonna be the place for her ears. It's also gonna be more forward, so it's not flat across the head. And now what I'm gonna do is just really roughly place her nose right at the bottom of that third line on her face. The nose is the biggest feature on her face, so I like to start off with that. It's gonna set everything else. It's gonna be a good reference point for how we place the rest of her features. So put that in there, very center. Make sure that the center of the nose is following the center line of her face too. And then since that next line is gonna be her eyebrows, I just wanna start off with where they meet at her nose. Follow the lines right there, and then just really roughly draw in that arch. I find it easier to just draw the big hollow shape that holds the eyeball. So I just like drawing that, and it kind of looks like a superhero mask. So that's how I think about it when I draw faces. So it's just this big shape. It's gonna be that big hollow on the skull, really. So it's not just so it will have more than the space for her eyes. But I like the look of this. It gives me room to place her actual eyebrows in the centers, which is what we are doing right here. I just find it a lot easier to draw the eyes once I have the eyeballs done behind it. So I tried to put that in there first. It's also very easier now to imagine the skull now that we have the eyes and the nose there. And then for the mouth, I'm just gonna put it right in the middle point of these two lines right here. Very rough. Again, it's just a placeholder until we really shape it to look like hers. And then I'm gonna use the nose to mark out how wide her mouth is. And then I'm gonna leave it like that, very simple. And now we already have the head, and I just want to draw in her neck and just carve it out to my liking later on. But yeah, shoulders very easy, just going down. We're not gonna draw the rest of her face for today. We're gonna focus on her face and her hair for today. So this is actually now a good baseline for our actual sketch. We already have all of her placeholders for her features. And now what we can do is shape it out to look like our portrait. So what we were doing before, it's kind of like we were drawing a model pose to like our portrait. What we're now going to do is carve it out to actually look like the photo that we're drawing. So we're just going to try to look at the contours of her face and have it follow the model we have underneath the base of the sketch. So basically, we're just gonna follow the overall shape of her head. And again, because we didn't put too much emphasis on getting the actual proportions on her, right? This is not gonna look exactly like our photo, but I do wanna try to at least get her features okay, much more than the proportions. I think that experimenting with the proportions makes it look like it's more intentional. Just what I thought from experience, really. But yeah, we're gonna try to follow what we see in the photo, but we're also just gonna draw it over the mold that we had as the initial sketch, if that makes sense. We're looking at the hairline, trying to get it to be the exact shape. We also want to get the lines of our clothes right. We're drawing very simple portraits like this. These lines are very important because they kind of make very big shapes that cut across our portrait. So we want to get the clothes right too. They're very big shapes, and so they really affect our portrait, and we want to get them right. The photo, I think, is also a lot more elongated than how I initially had it. So you will actually see me extend her hairline up, and just her overall head stretch it a little bit later as we go on. But to be honest, I didn't notice it as much while I was doing it. It's just easier to notice now that it's after the fact, and I can see it right beside our photo. So before we really get into drawing her actual features, what I'm doing is taking my kneaded eraser, and we're just gonna lightly tap it into our sketch. We don't want to rub it across the surface of our paper. Tapping it into the paper will just lift out some of the darkness that we used there, but it's not gonna affect the surface of the paper, which is important to do. You can also do the same thing with a regular eraser, just tap it down onto your sketch and not do any lines across your paper. I think it keeps the texture of the paper better that way. So we needed to do that because I wanted the sketch to be clean before I really start in and draw her features. I want to go in with her nose first, and what I'm doing right here is marking out the overall shape of her nose, not just the bridge. So once I have that area marked out, I'm then drawing the very tip of the nose, which is more rounded, maybe even a triangle at the very center, and then I can stretch that over to actually follow the bridge of her nose. And then having those lines there just makes it easier for me to then place her nostrils underneath. So want to make sure that I get that right. I also want to make sure that the curves of her nostrils, the curves that go around her nostrils are rounded too, just like she has it in the not just like she has in the photo. But yeah, it's very important to not just draw the bridge and the nostrils part of her nose, but also this big area that the nose takes up on her face. And then what I'm gonna do is mark out the eyebrows. I did make these lines much darker than I should have, but right now I'm just really marking out the shape of the eyebrows first. I want to make sure that I get the shape of them right so that when I go in and draw her eyes, it's much easier to see how they will look. And when I do get to her eyes, I want to make sure that they are draped across her eyeballs in the same way that they are in the photo. So her eyes are sort of draped more slanted across the roundness of the eyeball. So I wanted to get that right. I also wanted to make sure that once I get one part of the eye done, that I'm then doing the same eyelid, but on the other side, so I can try to get them to be very symmetrical. And then we're going to do the same thing for the bottom eyelids. Just making sure we're getting the shape at least as accurate as we can get them. On hers too, she also has folds under her eyes follow follow the eyeballs. So very easy to draw that right under her lower eyelid too. I think I sort of made her eyes much bigger than they are in the photo, but again, I'm trying not to worry too much about it. Just try to get the shapes of the features right. Again, the proportions we can play around with for our sketch. And then for her lips, I want to make sure that I get the shape of her mouth right. So how the lines are on her mouth are right first. The actual shape of her lips, I actually want to leave out very thin because I don't want to draw them. I always just like to shade in lips rather than draw them. So if I can get at least the overall shape of them right, then I can just leave them like that. So what I'm doing now is lifting out some of the lines for her eyebrows because I think that I shaded them into hard and they're very light in the photo. So I lifted that out. I also am just cleaning up the lines I have for her eyes. There's that fold on her left eye right there that I want to get. I'm also going to do the same thing for her other eye where I lift out some of those dark lines and then I can clean them up with this time more sure lines on top of them. So I didn't fully erase them. They just remained there as our guide now. And then I can draw her eyes more sure this time. It's the same for her eyebrows. Now that we've lifted out some of those dark shadows, we now have enough room to draw in the actual hair strands of her eyebrows still. Cleaning up the lines right here so that those darker lines, I don't mistake them for darker values later. Want to make sure that for this stage in our sketch that we are just doing the sketching for the outlines and we're cleaning them up because we're going to be doing a lot of shading for this sketch, actually more than I normally would do for a pencil sketch. So before we get to shading, I actually want to mark out the big shaded areas. So on her nose, they're very light, but mostly for her cheeks, there's some big areas of not just shadow, but like I think her blush. I want to make sure I get those right, and I want to make sure that they're placed on the dimensions of her face the same way that they are in the photo. They're not going to be the exact shapes as in the photo because the proportions on the photo and the sketch are different, but we do want to make sure that we are following the dimensions on her face in the same way. So I'm getting those very light lines on there. They do have to be light because we are doing a little bit more delicate shading on this sketch than, honestly, more than I normally would do for my sketches. And once those guidelines are placed, I am then gonna do another cleanup of my sketch. Just really need to make sure that it's not very dark and they just look like guidelines. So I'm lifting out some of these pencil sketches and doing a little bit of cleanup with my lines before we go and start with our shading. So this is the most exciting part of the process, which is when we finally get to the sketching. I have actually sharpened my pencil for this, so I want to make sure that it's very sharp, and this will actually help me keep my lines very, very subtle over my paper. Funnily enough, I just make sure that I'm doing very fine lines and following the guide I used, the ones I placed to mark out where the shading is going to be. So I'm following those and again using very light pressure on my paper so we can build up the shading later on. Um, we're mostly going to be fully shading over the entire thing. We're just avoiding the highlights. And that's the key to having a lot of dimension in our sketches, is to do this very light shading over most of the entire thing so that when we add more to it, even the lightest areas have dimension. So I'm going back to certain areas where they're darker, like her cheeks right here, still following where the guidelines are when we painted them. And also for her eyes, even on her irises, I'm making sure that I'm doing very light shading first because we also want dimension on there too. Still some areas on here that I think I made the lines a little bit too pronounced, like the ones between her eyebrows. Can fix that later though. What I want to make sure now is I'm doing the exact same shading for her nose, and I'm going over the overall shape of her nose, and again, not just the bridge of her nose, but the entire space that it's taking up on her face. So getting the roundness of her upper eyelid right here, leaving out that highlight at the center. And the same thing for her forehead. We do want to add dimension to it. So very light shading once again, still following the lines that we've placed before, and we're basically just leaving out the highlights for her forehead, which is just to the right of her forehead right there. Foreheads are actually a lot more flat than, at least than I expect them to be. So I'm then going over her upper lip right here, doing another layer of shading for this area along her chin. Want to make sure that it's very pronounced, and the same thing for her neck too. It's very much shaded in because there's a shadow going across it from her jaw. But not only that, it's also very soft and subtle that we don't actually see where her neck stops and her hair starts. So we want to get that in our shading too. Very light shading, even on her hair right here, which is very dark. But we want to make sure, again, that we are just marking those out for now. We're only leaving out the highlights, so we're not doing a dramatic sketching process initially. We just want to leave out the highlights. We almost just want to isolate each of the dimensions of her face. For her lips right here, I'm making sure I'm starting from where the opening of her mouth is, because that's always darker than the edges of the lips. And I'm doing the same thing for the bottom lip. Start from where the mouth is opened, and then also leave out the highlight right there to the side where we see it in the photo too. Want to make sure this is just as subtle as how we did her face. Don't want to overdo it, especially since in the photo her lips aren't very dark. Then what I'm gonna do is just check out areas where I think they can do with more shading. But once again, I'm being very subtle, just placing them in there with very thin lines and very, very softly across my paper as well. The places I've had trouble with in the shading was her hair, just because this horizontal lines are always harder for me to do, and her hair, since it has a very particular motion to them, I want to make sure that I at least follow that motion. So it's kind of hard for me to do vertical lines like in general, but I do still try to do that. I did avoid just rotating my sketch just because it's very disorientating on video. So yeah, I'm trying to make sure just that I'm trying to get it to be as even as I can get them. These very big shapes on her hair. There's some very defined lines that shouldn't be there, but again, this is just a good base for our next layers in our shading. This will also just help us see if the proportions of the sketch are okay. Like for mine, I can kind of see that her head was a little bit more flat than in the photo, so I'm basically just adding more on top. I do also still want to make sure that I'm not overdoing it. So again, very lightly when I do that, and very, very subtle at the time too. So I'm just gonna lightly go over her lips again. And then what I'm gonna do is brush my fingers across the shading, mostly to soften up the lines. We don't need this to be very smooth. I just want to soften up the lines that are already there. I don't want them to disappear. But yeah, that's what I'm doing right here. Also not recommended because just the oils in our hands could damage our sketch, but I really just do it just for sketches like this. Don't really care too much about preserving my sketch for now. So this right here is a very good first layer for the shading. I think that I'm very happy with how it looks, and now we can move on to using our darker pencil, which is this Mars Lumograph 8B pencil that I have. And this one is not just very soft and dark, but it's also a carbon pencil, so it doesn't reflect light like the graphite pencil does. So it's gonna show off really dark on film. So that's what I like exactly for this painting. So I'm starting with the darker edges on her hair first, just because it's very safe. And I want to see how far I can reach with how dark I can get this shading to be. For this part of the sketch though, I'm still just getting used to the feel of the pencil, trying to see if I can get an even laydown of shading on it before I can do subtle lines with the shading. So it's always easier to do that with the hair, just because we can always mask them out as hair strands later on. It's harder to get used to how your pencil will lay down color when you're doing it on the texture of skin. I'm slowly building up to the darkness that I can get with the hair. I am also just making sure that the edges are slightly darker than the rest of the hair, slightly though. When it comes to drawing the hair strands, I'm that are going over her forehead, I'm making sure that I'm very being very light on the paper because I'm already using a dark pencil. I'm making sure that I'm using the softer edges of my pencil for this, and that I'm not pushing too hard onto the paper, just because these smaller hair strands, there's finer hair strands on her face. They could easily I could easily lay them down too hard, and I don't want to do that. Just want to make sure that I'm being very light on my pencil, on those areas especially. I also want to make sure that when I am going to her cheek again and I'm painting the edges of her cheeks, that I am still following the shape that I see on the photo. I want to make sure that I am more like shading in the hair than lining the shape of her face, if that makes sense. It just gives you the idea that we don't want these darker lines to show. We just want it to look like it's a very dark color behind the shape of her face. And then add those very small hair strands right there. And once again, when we're doing those, we're making sure that we're being very light with our pencil because we're using a very dark pencil by nature. So we want to make sure that we're being very light-handed with it. Just really soft shading where it transitions onto her neck right there, right here. There's also a very dark shadow right under her chin that goes along her jaw, so we want to get that. This shapes out her face extremely well, so we want to make sure that we're being very precise with this line right here. So on one side where it touches her face, it's very precise, it's very sharp lines, and then on the other side it's just blends into a very soft shadow, so we want to get that too. I do wish I didn't take the darkness of her hair too far because it kind of made her neck too thin, and I didn't notice it while I was drawing. Making sure you guys do better with that area especially. I think I made her eyes too big. What I'm doing is making sure that I'm shading her eyeballs as well as the shape around her eyes right there. So we want to make sure there's shadow on her actual eyes as well as her eye bags. And then we're taking that very soft shading from her cheek all the way up to her nose and then to her eyebrows. So very delicate shading with our pencil right here. So we want to make sure that we're being very light on our paper. We always want to imagine that we are not altering the texture of our paper underneath it at all. We're just using the softness of our pencil to get these shading on our paper. So darkening up the lines on her eyes actually make them look smaller, and so it almost looks like it worked out the way we made her outlines look bigger. But then again, it's still very stylized. There's still gonna be that disproportionate look to it. We do want to make sure though that we're being very careful with the shading around her eyes, because if we ever go too far with them, we can alter the shape of her eyes very easily. So these are very dark lines on her eyes, but still we can go further later on. We just want to make sure that we get the shape that we want for her eyes, and that when they're shaded, they look fairly accurate. Doing the same thing for her eyebrows, we are shading it very softly with the softer side of our pencil before lightly drawing the hair strands on top. And then we can take that down to her nose, shaping it out a little bit more. Around her nostrils really needed more shading, so we want to make sure that we get these areas to be darker and also more detailed with the lines that we had, because those were just too soft before. Adding in the shadows right here will also emphasize the softness of the very tip of her nose. So get that shadow right under the tip of her nose right there, and then make sure that we're getting the roundness of her nose right too. Be very soft with this in-between area between her two eyebrows. That part is always very hard for me to do. We're gonna do the same thing to her eyebrows, shade in the overall shape first before with very soft lines before we draw in the strands of her eyebrows, and just as soft too. So we're doing the same thing for her right eye that we did to her left. We want to make sure that we're being very accurate with the lines, and that we are getting the darkness of her irises right. And being accurate with the lines is just the key to getting the eyes right. Again, because they're so prominent on the face, and also because we stylized the proportions so much that if we ever make this too big or too small, it's just not gonna work. So you have to follow the sketch fully, as well as get the shading right that we can see from the photo, too. So we're making sure that her upper eyelids are rounded out by shading them in as well. Want to get those dimensions right, as well as the defined one on her eyebrows. So want to make sure we're paying attention to everything, not just the ones that are outlined. This little nook above her lip, we want to get that right too. Just really making sure that we're getting shadow around her nose. And then we are going to add a little bit more shading to her cheeks so we can soften up the lines on her face. For her lips too, we want to make sure that the opening of her mouth is a lot darker than the rest of her lips. So always start with that. It's always a lot safer to start there. And when we're shading, you want to start right at those areas too, because her lips aren't outlined at all. So starting from where they are the darkest is just a lot easier to do. And again, we want to make sure that we're being very light with these shadows. Her lips aren't very dark in the photos. We just want to make sure that they're slightly standing out first, and we can always add to them later on. The shadows around them are just as important as the lips because they ultimately just shape out her face. So we want to make sure we get the dimensions on those shadows right. Her cheeks are also very flushed in the photo, so that's why you see me going back to those areas. On the right side too, the flush on her cheeks sort of just goes to her eye bag, so we want to get that connection right there as well. The edges of the face is always going to be a lot softer, so we always want to get that gradient right with the shading from where the outline is and then going to the lips. So we're going to repeat that same process for the rest of her jaw. And then for her ears, you kind of just want to shape them by outlining them first, and then later on we will be cleaning that line up by drawing her hair more. For now, I want to go back to her face and clean up these shadows. I also want to add more hair strands to her hair. And again, while we're doing this, make sure you're being very light on your paper. Don't push too hard on your paper. Just let out the pencil marks by letting them graze across your paper. It's a very different technique when it comes to the rest of her hair. I do need those areas to be a lot darker, so I am pushing a little bit more onto my paper, but still not enough that we can't build up on it anymore. We just want to make sure that we get this mostly even shading on her hair, and later on we will add more of the hair strands, so these unevenness you see right now won't really show up that much. I think in general it's just I have a lot of trouble drawing horizontal lines. That's why it's hard for me to shade this area horizontally. You could make this easier by rotating your drawing, like I said before, but I don't want to do that for the video. It's very disorientating, so I did just try to get this area shaded in as evenly as I could, but still not get the pencil to be as dark as I can get it. So this way I can have an even laydown of color for her hair and have it separate from the rest of the drawing. And then later on I can push more of the pencil, build up the pressure while I am slowly adding in the hair strands. So you can see right here I'm slowly building up the pressure, still no visible hair strands, or at least intentional ones yet, just on these very edges. The idea is still that I want to build up to the darkness that I want for her hair. Right now this is still just the initial laydown of color for it. And again, when we go over to the hair strands on her face that go over her face, the very light ones, make sure that we're using very light strokes across our paper so it's not too dark, so those hair strands aren't too dark. You can see right here where I accidentally made the pencil, where I accidentally pushed the pencil more onto the paper, that area looked, that hair strand looked so dark. So you can see me just going back to her face and just getting my hand used to softer areas again. But yeah, I'm just gonna do the same thing for the rest of her hair using very soft lines and trying to get as even of a dark lay down color as I can for this second layer on her hair, because once it's dark enough and it's separated itself enough from the rest of the sketch, we can then add the hair strands. The ones that go over her shoulder, though, I am not too strict with how they look. I just want to make sure that I'm getting movement from them, but I'm also not adding too many of them in there. There's still, to get the variation in the hair strands, some hair strands I draw very light and some of them I draw very dark, just so we can still get that difference in there. Want to make sure that this top part of her hair is high enough still, shading the rest of the drawing with her, like on her shirt and on her neck right here, paying attention to the shadows that her shirt is casting on her skin as well. It's very important just because they're very prominent shapes on the sketch, and so they do just alter the overall shape of our sketch. So I want to make sure that those are shaded right as well. And then just going back to these hair strands that are going over her shoulder, I'm really just being messy with them. Most important thing for me when it comes to these hair strands is that they have movement and that they have variations in the hair strands too. Some of them are darker and some of them are lighter, just enough so that it looks like there's dimension on those hair strands as well. But I don't want them to take away from the rest of the drawing, specifically her face. So after we paid attention to the individual parts of the sketch, what we want to do is take a step back and try to see where we can push the envelope when it comes to the darker areas and where we can add more definition to some areas. So what I'm gonna do is actually sharpen up my pencil off to the side. I sharpen it up and we're working with a sharper pencil now. This will just give us more room to get darker lines versus before. So you can see I'm using it to sharpen up these lines on her face. And also we can do the same thing for her hair. Always should be darker than before, and now that we are intending to use these darker lines, we want to make sure that we're now following where the hair strands should be going, because they're going to be more visible, especially on top of the very even laydown of color we had initially for her hair. And then when it comes to adding shading to her face, I want to make sure that I'm using the flat side of my pencil so that it's very subtle. And I'm just going to use that to add more shading to just areas that I think it needs. So on her cheeks and right by her eyes, getting those areas of shadow just makes the lighting look softer. And this is kind of hard if you're not used to doing these softer doing these softer doing these softer shadings with a very dark pencil. You can always practice on a different part of the paper first before using it for her before using it for the face, because there's really no going back from that. On her eyes too, I did on her eyes and her lips, I tried to slowly bring in more attention to them, but I wanna still make sure that they're not fully standing out, that they're just gonna be more legible on her face, because before we didn't really shade them as much as they needed to be. And for the rest of this sketch, I'm just going to be repeating the last steps that we did, which is add these very dark areas where they need to be more defined. And then on her face, if it needs more shading, I will be using very soft lines, but I will just be repeating those steps while taking a step back and looking at the overall sketch. Right now is the part of the process where I'm not really looking at the reference photo. I'm just now making sure that the sketch that we have right now will stand on its own, and that it is strong enough on its own, because up to this point we were really just comparing it to the reference photo. I always take this time before I finish the sketch to look at the sketch by itself and to just make sure that it's as good in its own as it was when we were comparing it to the reference photo, especially for a sketch like this where we really stylized the proportions on her. We want to make sure that it's just as strong as the original photo, which was already amazing by itself. And once again, like all of my reference photos I use on my videos, I have them all in one Pinterest board that I will have linked in the description. And as I said, if you guys want to see a watercolor tutorial for this exact same photo, I have that on my Patreon, and the full link to that will be in the same description as well. Thank you guys so much for watching this one, and please let me know if you decided to do this with me. I am so thankful for you guys for watching, and thank you so much for my patrons for supporting me, and I will be seeing you guys again very soon. Bye!